Hello again. Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, what we're going to be doing, as was mentioned earlier, is really defining what social psychology is all about. In addition to that, we're going to be going over how we'll be approaching different social psychology topics throughout the entirety of this class. Hopefully, after you're done with this, you'll have a much clearer sense of where we're going to be going and why we're doing some of the things that we'll be doing throughout the entirety of this class. So let's get started first by just defining what makes social psychology social psychology. To understand what makes social psychology unique, one of the things I always like to do is just go back to what the definition of psychology itself is as a whole. If we look at what most psychologists aim to do, their goal is almost always first understanding why we're doing the things we're doing, then using that understanding to be better predictors of our world around us. This happens for pretty much every branch of psychology. Clinical psychology, cognitive, personality, essentially anything you can think of usually has a focus on understanding why we're doing what we're doing to predict things in the future, with, of course, different takes on what we're trying to understand and predict. And this is true for social psychology as well. An attempt to understand things is always the first step. But in social psychology, what we're focusing most of our attention on are these things called social factors. There's some of the terms that we're going to be discussing that are very similar to it, but essentially what we're looking at here is things that are happening in the environment that are impacting us. Usually, most people in social psychology focus on the impact on an individual that the social environment has. There are some individuals in social psychology, though, that will focus also on how an environment could potentially impact a group. And then when we start talking about groups and individuals, one of the caveats that many people start to get into is the interaction between how people themselves can impact groups and how groups can impact the individual. This circular relationship is actually something we'll be exploring later on as we progress through the class. But understand, when we're doing all of these different kind of peers into the life of an individual, we're doing it with the attempt to, once we understand it, be able to predict things. Be able to say, look, if these things are happening in the environment, or this person's exposed to this group, this is probably how they're going to think or react or maybe even feel about that situation. Those goals of social psychology is what makes this branch of psychology unique. Again, there's still this attempt to understand and predict, but in social psychology, the focus is on the social environment and sometimes groups that we're trying to understand so we can predict how people will behave in different social environments and in different groups. We want to really pin down a definition of social psychology. What you'll usually see when people define what social psychology is kind of a scientific attempt to understand how thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are being impacted, both for groups and individuals, by the social world around us, be it real or potentially, and this is kind of neat, imagined. Many people in social psychology, as we'll see when we progress, sometimes study impacts of social environments that are all internally in our head. This push to go fast, or these kind of stressors that we might have, or things that are kind of pulling us in different directions. Some of those might be externalized. They might be physically there, or they could just be things that we've come up with on our own. And when we're looking at those things that are pushing us, we again give them a name. Sometimes you'll see people call them social factors. Other times in textbooks and research, you'll see those things called social influences. In essence, social influences, social factors, are those things in our world that are potentially impacting our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And when social psychologists study stuff, they tend to usually specialize in specific social influences. Things like academia, or stressful situations, or kind of group dynamics. A lot of different things that we'll actually be looking at through the class. But it's also important to note when we start talking about these social influences that there is a lot of room for variability. You might be surprised as we progress in this class when we talk about how effective some of the manipulations are on people's behaviors. We might say that, say, 65% of the population in this sample was kind of moved in this direction, or there seems to be a mild correlation between these two things that we're looking at. And it might even lead you to question whether or not what we're finding is really reliable or valid at all. You understand that one of the big reasons why it is so hard to find very concrete evidence, especially in social psychology, also for personality for that matter, is because when we look at how the environment is impacting individuals, the environment that we all encounter is kind of unique to us. One of the things that will often be cited in social psychology research is these ideas of these things called construals. The kind of twists and turns that we take with the material that we're being presented that tends to cause us all to experience the world in very different ways. I love this picture of an elephant that you see pictured here on this slide because it really highlights how, even if we're all relatively in the same spot and experiencing pretty much the same thing, we might take something very different from it. Because how we're impacted by the social environment is highly dependent upon what it is we're seeing, what it is we're making sense of, and what it is we're bringing into that specific situation. So if we talk about how being rushed impacts us, or how when somebody's very nice to us, it changes our behavior, our thinking, our emotions, we have to appreciate that not all people will see the same event that a social psychologist is setting up as being one that's rushing us, or one that somebody's being nice in. There might be other things that they're seeing or taking with them or kind of interpreting that cause them to not encounter that situation in the same way, and therefore maybe not react in the same way, even if the effect would have been the same if they had construed that situation in the same way as some of their peers. So what else makes social psychology unique then? One of the things we also have to do when defining what social psychology is all about is separate it out from lots of people who like to think of themselves as social psychologists. And this is kind of unique to this branch of psychology. There aren't a lot of people walking around saying that they're professional developmental psychologists just because they have kids, or people that say they're professional clinical psychologists because they know a couple people that sought therapy or maybe even sought therapy themselves. But in social psychology, you're inundated with people on television, people in classrooms, people who you encounter on the streets that swear up and down that they fully understand the power of the environment on our everyday behaviors, or that they're specialists in one particular area of social psychology because of their encounters or experience. And that's really problematic thinking. Much like other branches of psychology, for somebody to become a social psychologist, they need to not only find something interesting, but they need to actually do research on that specific topic. That means collecting data, verifying some of their ideas through empirical evidence, and ensuring that there's a way to understand not only what it is you're looking at, but the context around what you're finding. This need for collecting verifiable evidence is something that really separates out social psychologists from people that are on the news, that tend to call themselves media reporters or folk theorists. It also separates out the field from lots of historical areas of philosophy that attempted many times to understand the impacts of the environment on us without really being able to find irrefutable evidence to support a lot of their notions. Arguments are great. In fact, they oftentimes get us started in some of the things that we're looking at in social psychology. But if somebody truly is a social psychologist, and if we're going to cover what they do in a class like this, we need that empirical evidence. And it is probably important to note here at this moment that even social psychologists themselves sometimes fall short of the standards that we set. Many of our social psychologists these days kind of fall into the trap of needing to collect data in certain ways to verify some of the ideas that they have, especially in this need to publish article after article in order to keep, say, a position at a major research institute. And it's led to this thing that we started to experience a couple decades ago called the replication crisis, where lots of social psychologists started publishing things that were based on faulty data, sometimes just because of errors in research, but more problematically, many people started to believe that this was kind of an intentional thing, where people were either making up data or massaging data in ways that was extremely unethical to try to kind of make a name for themselves. There's a big insistence in this class that we're going to try to focus our attention on some of the more established research that's out there. But I do want you to kind of keep in mind that there is kind of a need to always push and prod on some of the things that are covered so we truly understand if what we're finding is more than just circumstance. We really do want to be sure that some of the concepts that we're covering meet the rigorous standards that we try to set for ourselves in this branch of psychology that we call social psychology. This also is probably a good time to talk about how social psychology is unique from the other branches of research and psychology that do also hold themselves up to high standards. Many of you might have encountered a sociology class somewhere along the way and wondered if what you were going to learn in this class was identical to what you learned in that class. I will admit there are going to be some overlaps between the two areas. But what really makes social psychology different from sociology is we're not, in this particular class, looking at societies as a whole. Most often, sociologists are interested in kind of large-scale impacts of environmental things and other factors that shift large-scale groups. Social psychologists oftentimes focus on the individual, but even when they focus on the group, they tend to put most of their efforts and kind of attention on the individual level, how kind of subtle shifts impact, theoretically, all of us, not entire societies that we might be interested in looking at. We'll see as we progress kind of this in-between ground when we start talking about cultural psychology later on in the class. But I want you to at least have an understanding of where social psychologists and sociologists kind of assume there's some subtle differences between them. Another branch of psychology that often gets kind of intertwined with social psychology is a branch called personality psychology. And I always find this kind of ironic because if you look at lots of attempts to understand where human behavior is coming from, many people tend to argue that our behaviors are really a byproduct of two big things: our environment, the social factors that we talked about earlier, and also our personality. You'll see me numerous times in this class reference a very famous equation of B equals F of P and E, where essentially our behavior is a byproduct of the function of our personality and our environment combined. Now, this equation really highlights how personality is distinct from the social environment. In that sense, personality is talking about your enduring characteristics, where social psychology is talking about the kind of overlying factors that impact all of us. And what most people have argued is that these things both are trying to accomplish the same thing, understand why we're doing what we're doing, but they're doing it from different angles. Personality looking at our consistencies, and social psychology looking at the environment. And what we tend to find is if we really want to predict behavior well, we need both components to do so. And you'll see in lots of publications that are out there that many people do consider both personality and social factors when trying to really understand a specific situation better. Another area that sometimes gets mixed together with social psychology is this branch called behaviorism. It's probably fair to say that social psychology kind of came about as a result of the behavioral movement that started to occur in the 1920s. When behaviorists started to focus their attention on looking at kind of the changes that the environment had on us, always focusing on the observable, lots of people did flock to this area of interest in psychology. But eventually, there were a number of individuals that contended that behaviorism might not be able to explore all the things that we wanted to explore. It couldn't explore emotions very well. It couldn't talk about interpretations and thought and how that was playing a role in things. And it couldn't explore how some of the environmental factors that we were looking at might not actually impact our behavior, but it might impact us internally. And that's where social psychology kind of broke off from behaviorism. When we started to undergo these realizations that there was more that we could look at beyond the scope of behaviorism. Now, it's really critical to highlight again that these three branches of psychology are not that far from social psychology. They all are trying to understand what it is we're doing and use that to predict things. It's just that, again, angle they're using to understand things is different. And it makes up different branches of psychology, much like all the other branches of psychology that are out there. So how are we going to then discuss the topics within social psychology that we're covering? Well, as I mentioned in the first class, we're going to split this class up into 4 different modules. The first section linked to an exam is going to focus a lot on what we call social thinking. This is going to give us the ability to explore things like social cognition, emotions, sense of self, big topics that really are kind of the cornerstones of social psychology. We'll then transition into looking at social influences, where we explore how groups can impact us and how the conformity can really change the way we behave. Essentially, we'll try to discover how all these moving components to our environment are really changing us at any given time. In the end, we'll look at kind of specialized topics that sometimes people call social relations, when we look at attraction and aggression and pro-social behavior, and a kind of overarching topic that really bleeds into a lot of stuff called stereotypes. Essentially, breaking things up into 3 different components is a pretty doable thing, that you will find, and this is important to note, lots of overlaps between these areas. And this brings me to a really critical thing that I want to bring to your attention before we close up today. In this class, I'm going to do the same thing that most social psychologists do when trying to cover topics. I'm going to try to cover things sort of as a narrative, of ebbing and flowing and going between topics that are related. But I want you to understand that in social psychology, what we study is so interrelated that the narrative can change dramatically even if we're trying to cover the same exact material. It's not that we disagree on things, it's just we choose to incorporate certain things together in a story that makes the story slightly different. There's different turns and different things that are added into different sections. And this is particularly true with the textbook and how I'm going to cover material within this class. Even within the first 2 chapters that you're supposed to read for this class, you'll find many times where something covered in the book is not covered in the lecture, and in fact is covered much later in future lectures. And you'll find times when we're covering stuff in lecture that's not covered in the book that will oftentimes pop up in the book in a completely different place. That does not mean that there's any disagreement between the text and myself. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm very well aligned with a lot of the people that wrote the book, since I've known many of the individuals linked to this textbook for a number of decades at this point. It means essentially that the way we're telling our story is slightly different. And we're going to get to the same end point. It's just we'll get there at different paces. So if you're looking for what to focus on when watching the presentations and studying for the exams, know that what we're covering in the presentations is going to be the primary thing that we're going to focus on in the exams, and it's going to be the primary thing that you're going to see in the written assignments. But don't just skip over that stuff that's not covered in those presentations when you're reading the textbook, because those things will oftentimes pop up again later on. And if you skip them now, it'll be much more difficult to understand those other things later on. I hope all these things can help you as you're progressing. And I hope now that we've covered this, you have a better understanding of what social psychology is all about. And that gives us the ability to have our first written assignment and then turn our attention to our first kind of broad areas of social psychology. They're called social cognition and emotion. Please, if you can, make sure you do those readings if you haven't already. Make sure you put some effort into that write-up, and hopefully I'll be speaking with you again in the near future when we get over the next topics of social cognition and and emotions. Take care all.